Oyumanoim oyoyoyoy shevesachim Yom yochad Kulanu bnei Yisrael Kulanu enoislim toida lakel oyoyoyoy hinei matroy Oyumanoim oyoyoyoy shevesachim Yom yochad Ani litvak Ani chassid Ani bresla Ani svardi
I love that song. Maybe I'm a little biased. He's got a line, Ani Litvak, right? Not, my name is Litvak, I am a Litvak, right? A Litvak is a Jew from Lithuania. That was Joey Newcomb singing his song, B'nai HaMelech, Children of the King. I know that Moshe Storch has been in some of Joey's recordings. That sounded like Moshe in there. I gotta ask him. Maybe he was in there too. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? It's great to be together on a Sunday night. We got a beautiful page of learning to do together. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us? Well, leave that there. Who is with us as we get it going on a Sunday night? Yehudit in South Carolina, James in Indy, Stephen in New Hampshire, Melissa in Great Neck, New York, Pauline in Arkansas, Gail in Virginia, Renee in Indy. Irdiancia Tanjung says Shalom. I've seen your name before. I know that you're in another country, but I can't remember which. Miriam in Hayden, Colorado. John in Longmeadow, Massachusetts. Crystal in British Columbia. Sharon in New Jersey. Billy in Virginia. Paula is with us with a nice rose. Lucy in Minnesota. John in Sedona. This is skipping around on me. Julie in Texas. Crystal says it's almost Purim. Yes, it is. So Purim is Friday day, and the plan is we'll do our annual reading of the book of Esther at noon Pacific, which is the time of this class normally. So my plan is to do a double daf either the night before or the night after, right? So either Thursday night, which is when it's Purim Eve. So that's also a little problematic because I want to get to a Megillah reading. So maybe the double daf will be Saturday night when we come out of Shabbos, Motzi Shabbos, something like that. But we'll announce the reading of the book of Esther. But so you know, noon on Friday. Where am I? Nancy in North Carolina, Dennis in Ohio, Donna in Bahama, North Carolina, Lisa in Dallas, Judy in Grants Pass, Valencia in Texas, and Ann in Merced. Welcome, everybody. Great to be with you. Over there on the YouTube side, Lynn in Texas, and Michael in Scranton. This is the day. This is the day. This is an AT shirt. This is a line from Psalm 118. We are having a sale right now. Nina will put the link. 10% off with promo code AWESOME on everything in the AT store, including this shirt, the Grateful Yid shirt, Baruch Hashem, I don't roll on Shabbos, all the good ones. Everything is on sale. Pillows, towels, mugs, all kinds of great stuff. They make fantastic gifts. The reason I thought to wear this shirt today is because I just wrote a little piece for the 929 website. So that's a program a little bit similar to Daf Yomi. We read a page of Talmud a day. The 929 program is to read one chapter of the Bible per day. And if you do that, there's 929 chapters in the Hebrew Bible, so it takes about 3 years to read one chapter a day. So the upcoming, I guess is in a week or two, will be Psalm 118. That program is in the book of Psalms right now. So I wrote a little commentary on Psalm 118. Psalm 118 is the climax of Hallel, right? So every time we have a festival to celebrate and we recite Hallel, the songs of thanksgiving and praise, mostly Hallel is Psalms 113 through 118. And as I may have mentioned on this show before, you know, Nina and I made a movie about Abraham Lincoln saving Lincoln. available on Prime and Apple Movies and Roku and other platforms. So we really, researched the Civil War deeply. And it didn't come up in a lot of sources, but in one strong source, it was described so beautifully. After the Civil War ended, right, or when it basically ended, when the peace was signed between Generals Grant and Lee at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia on April 9th, 1865, the next night in Washington, D.C., every window in every residence and every public building had a candle or a gaslight burning. And across the west portico of the Capitol building, there was a massive cloth transparency, and written on it was 160 feet across, and it was illuminated with gas jet lights. And it said, "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes." That's Psalm 118, verse 23. And then the next verse is even more important, I believe, and certainly to me. "This is a day the Lord made. Let us rejoice and exult in it." Right? This is a day the Lord made. And my comment on that line, right? So in that context, right, that this is the Lord's doing, it is marvelous in our eyes. This is a day the Lord made. Let us exult and rejoice in it. It comes sort of it comes easily off the tongue to rejoice when a war has ended, right? Or for example, the vaccine is announced and the plague is going to end. Or, you encounter some kind of a salvation. You were in debt, the debt gets paid off. You narrowly avoid death in a car accident. God forbid you have such a close call. Anything like that, we're quick to say, "Oh, thank God," right? And by extension, this is a day that the Lord made. The challenge that I believe God extends to us through the Torah is to think about that every day. Every day is a day that the Lord made. Every day is a day that we should be rejoicing. Now, obviously, it's not easy. Obviously, this is a challenge. A lot of us, people have big problems in their life. I'm not minimizing that at all. But where there's life, there's hope. So every time we wake up to a new day, this is a day the Lord made, and finding a way to rejoice in that day, finding traces, of the paintbrush of the creator of the universe, as it were, the artist of the universe, seeing his hand in our world, in our lives. It takes a keen eye. It takes looking into the world, trying to see God's presence so that we can rejoice. It's not always easy. Sometimes it's very difficult. But that's the challenge. And that's why our sages say, and particularly in Carlebach Minyanim, people who daven in the Carlebach style, it's a mitzvah to be happy, right? It's a mitzvah to be happy. It's a command. It's an obligation to find ways to rejoice in this world. At a minimum, where there's life, there's hope. So you awake to a new day. That's reason enough to rejoice. But if you can keep finding more reasons to celebrate that this day exists and that the Lord made it and that there's so much good in the world, even amidst the tragedy, the difficulty, the evils, the strife, the disease, everything, even with all of that, there is still so much good and beauty and righteousness in the world. This is the day. All right, let's get to our Talmud study tonight. We are completing chapter 8 with God's help. We are on Daf Tzadi Beis, that's page 92 here in Tractate Pesachim, the 4th volume of the Talmud, the laws of Passover. This whole chapter has been about how we constitute the group of people who come together and register to eat the Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb, the Passover offering, which of course is only brought when the temple is standing in Jerusalem. Tonight we're covering the 9th Mishna of this chapter 8. It's quite a bit shorter than chapter 7 was, for example. But tonight we'll do the Mishnah and all of its Gemara and complete our journey through chapter 8. And with God's help, tomorrow we'll start chapter 9. Mishnah number 9, here in chapter 8. The onain. Okay, an onain, that's a Hebrew word, is the acute mourner. It's not just a mourner, it's the mourner on the day that he or she has lost a close relative. An acute mourner, a mourner on the day of the death of an immediate relative, is prohibited from eating sacrificial food. By Torah law, the prohibition only applies on the day of death itself, but it is permitted to partake of sacrificial food on the following night. So remember that every day in the Hebrew calendar begins in the evening, right? So the 8th, I don't know exactly which day it is right now, the 15th of Adar is Friday coming up, because that's Purim. So I don't know, maybe we're on the 10th of Adar right now. So the 10th of Adar, well, now it's the 11th, right? Because here it has become night here in Los Angeles, so now it's the new day, right? So if your relative dies during daytime, okay, so then you can't, and it's your father, let's say, God forbid, your parent, so you can't partake of sacrificial foods on that day. We actually learned that out from Aaron when he lost 2 of his sons in the desert during the incident of Nadav and Avihu bringing a strange fire onto the altar in the tabernacle. So you can't eat sacrificial foods on the day that your immediate relative has died. But when nightfall comes, it's the next day on the calendar. So by Torah law, you could eat sacrificial foods that night, sacrificial foods that are permitted for you to eat. If you're a priest, there's more sacrificial foods that are permitted for you. But as we've seen, the Paschal lamb is a sacrificial offering. The festival peace offerings is a sacrificial offering. So you can't partake of them on the day that your immediate relative dies, but that night, what is the status? Here we learn in the Mishnah, by rabbinic decree, the period of acute mourning is extended to include the night as well. So you would think, oh, okay, so I can't eat a chagiga that night. I can't eat a festival peace offering that night. I can't eat the Paschal lamb, the Korban Pesach, the Passover offering that night after the day on which an immediate relative dies. However, despite this rabbinic decree, an acute mourner immerses during the day in the mikveh and eats his Paschal lamb in the evening. So that the acute mourner may not eat sacrificial offerings during the day, no sacrificial offerings. That night, he may not, that's by Torah law, that night, by rabbinic decree, he may not eat other sacrificial offerings, but he may eat the Korban Pesach, the Passover offering, and the Gemara will discuss why. So he may eat the Paschal lamb that night. He may still not eat other sacrificial food. However, one who hears about the death of his dead, in other words, he discovers that one of his immediate relatives died more than 30 days after the death, his status of acute mourning applies on a rabbinic level, right? So this is much more common in the ancient world than today. You know, an immediate relative might have died. There's no phones, no telegram, no telegraph, right? So when do people hear about it? It might be many days from the actual date of when it happened that the person gets the news. If it's more than 30 days, we actually saw that in Tractate Eruvin, there's different laws about how they observe, what kind of mourning practices they engage in when it's been more than 30 days since the actual death happened. Here we're just talking about, well, is this person going to be qualified to eat the Paschal lamb that night or not, right? So what does it say? So one who hears about the death of his dead, i.e. discovers that one of his immediate relatives died more than 30 days after the death, his status of acute mourning applies on a rabbinic level. That's what we've learned so far, right? So he's only an acute mourner, like somebody whose dead died that day. For him, he only heard about it that day. It happened more than 30 days earlier. So it's by rabbinic decree that he is an acute mourner. By Torah law, he is not an acute mourner. So we'll see what the effect of that is with regard to the Paschal lamb. We haven't been told yet. And one who gathers the bones of his parents I'll just read Rav Steinsalz's comment here. His elucidation. One who gathers the bones of his parents who are buried in a temporary location for their flesh to decay and who is moving them to a permanent burial place must also observe a day of acute mourning by rabbinic decree. So this one is likened to the one who hears the news that more than 30 days earlier their immediate relative died. And we'll discuss what this means, moving the bones, in one moment. So these two cases, one who moved the bones that day or one who got the news of the immediate relative dying but more than 30 days earlier, both of these mourners immerse in the mikveh and eat all types of sacrificial food at night. Since in these cases, even during the day, the mourning is only by rabbinic decree, not by Torah law. The sages did not extend it into the evening. So once nightfall comes, they don't have the status of an acute mourner anymore. They did need to immerse in the mikveh, but after that, nightfall comes, they're fully qualified to eat the Paschal lamb. Before I continue the Mishnah, so this idea of gathering the bones, very strange to our, let me just adjust this. It's very strange to our ear. What is he talking about? And this is fascinating, right? We're just accustomed that what happens when a person dies. You put him in a box, right? Either a nice coffin or, Jews, very plain pine wood box, and put that in the ground and bury it, and then, the body in the box decompose in the ground. That was not the custom a couple thousand years ago. That is not what people did, right? So imagine the Holy Land. There weren't a lot of trees. They weren't making coffins out of them. So what did they do? When the person died, they would lay them to rest in a crypt, right, which is much more like a cave, some kind of a cave. I mean, that is what we understood when Abraham purchased the cave of Machpelah as a burial place, a final resting place for Sarah, and then Isaac and Rebekah were buried there also, and so were Jacob and Leah. And there's actually an understanding that that same cave is where Adam and Eve came to rest. So what is it that we know about that cave, right? They're not in the dirt. They're in a cave. So the body is laid to rest in this cave. The door of the cave is sealed, as it were, and the flesh decomposes off the bones. The people, the relatives, will return sometime later when enough time has passed for the flesh to decay off the bones, and then they move the bones into, I want to get this word right, an ossuary. Is that the word? I'm not sure. I've never actually said that word out loud before. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Ossuary, an ossuary, which is like a sort of large box made out of stone that they put the bones inside of. And so that was the common burial practice at that time. They would lay the dead to rest in the crypt. Then they would return. I don't know what the amount of time was, a year, more than a year, when the flesh had decomposed, and then they just put the bones into the ossuary. And then this is, of course, the understanding, which was the understanding then as now, that the Jewish tradition holds that when the Messiah comes, the dead will be resurrected. Right, and we will receive our bodies again, and all the Jews in history who didn't lose their place in the world to come for one reason or another, so the vast majority, will return and get a new body, as it were, and will people the world in the time of the Messiah. So what we see is that all you need is the bones, right? And God forbid, the question always comes up in the Holocaust, all these people against their will were cremated, and the tradition also teaches that God will give those people not only a new body, but also the bones that they need to be the core of that body. But at any rate, the idea is that the bones will rise, get flesh again, and be resurrected. The dead will be resurrected at the time of the Messiah. So what we see from this is that the sages didn't feel like the bones needed to be laying in an ordered way, looking like a skeleton. It was fine that the bones could all be sort of bunched into that ossuary, that container of bones for a whole family. I was not aware of this. I found it fascinating. All right, to finish the Mishnah, the last clause of the Mishnah, with regard to a convert who converted on Erev Pesach, right? So a convert finished his conversion process on Erev Pesach, so that is the day before Passover begins that night. We're talking about the 14th of Nisan. The afternoon of the 14th of the Hebrew month of Nisan is when we slaughter the Paschal lamb. So here's a person completing his conversion on that day. What do we do about this person? Beis Shammai say he immerses in the mikveh like these other people, and then that night he's qualified to eat the Paschal lamb. Recall that a non-Jew does not participate in eating the Passover offering. That is a law that's only for the Jews. He's a convert, so now he is a Jew. And so Beis Shammai say, right, so he just immerses because he came through that procedure. He converted that day, and the final step for a man is a circumcision and then an immersion. The immersion is actually the final step, is going through the mikveh, and then you come out and you're a convert. And so that night he would eat of the lamb. That's according to Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel say, one who separates from the foreskin, so now we're talking about a man who converts. Women don't have to have this concern. But Beis Hillel say that one who separates from the foreskin by being circumcised is ritually impure, like one who separates from the grave after coming into contact with a corpse. Consequently, he must first observe the 7-day purification process necessary to remove ritual impurity imparted by a corpse. Only then, from the 8th day after that circumcision and immersion, is this person considered tahor, right? A man who converted would only become tahor and therefore able to eat sacred offerings on the 8th day after the conversion. These days were all assumed to be tameh. So in terms of modern day conversions, this concern is not really part of the process. But when the temple is standing and you have to be in a state of tahara, a state of purity, ritual purity, in order to partake in the Korban Pesach, if one was circumcised on that day and immersed in the mikveh, he still has to wait about a week until he's going to be considered tahor and qualified to eat sacred offerings. So this person is going to have to observe Pesach at Pesach Sheni. He's going to have to come back for the second Passover and eat of the Paschal lamb then. Now, you might think, why are the sages saying that this man who converted on the afternoon before Passover begins that night, that he's going to be deemed tameh, ritually impure, as if like he's somebody who just separated from the grave? Are the sages saying that one who comes in from being a non-Jew, it's as if he's coming in from, sort of symbolically or spiritually being dead? No, not at all. That is not what they're saying. It's a very practical reason why this person is going to have to wait a week, as we shall see in the Gemara momentarily. Okay, now we go into the Gemara on this whole Mishnah. So first, what is the reason that an acute mourner may eat the Paschal lamb in the evening? And the Tan of the Mishnah holds that the observance of acute mourning at night after the day of one's immediate relative's death is a rabbinic prohibition, right? You're only really an acute mourner during the day. The rabbis, by rabbinic decree, extended that status into the night and said that you wouldn't be qualified to eat sacred offerings that night, but that's only by rabbinic decree. So the question, therefore, is a rabbinic decree going to come and override the Torah obligation to participate in eating the Paschal lamb on the night of the 15th? And with regard to the Paschal lamb, the sages waived their own prohibition because they did not uphold their statement prohibiting consumption of sacrificial food in a situation in which doing so would violate a prohibition that carries the punishment of kares. Kares is excision, death at the hands of the heavenly court. The sages argue about exactly what that means. possibly that one's life is shortened, that your fate hangs in the balance of the heavenly court. But the point is, it's a punishment that is written in the written Torah, that one who does not participate in Pesach, doesn't bring the Paschal lamb, his sin is upon him, which is a formulation for kares. And with respect to not eating matzah or eating leavened bread during Passover, it specifically says that this one will be punished with kares, as is the case with one who neglects to offer the Paschal lamb. On the other hand, with regard to other sacrificial food, like the festival peace offering, they maintained their prohibition because they upheld their statement, their rabbinic decree, in a situation in which neglecting to eat the sacrificial food entails only the neglect of a positive mitzvah, right? So when the sages make a decree and you're following their law, if it seems like their law contradicts a Torah law, so you're going to follow what the rabbis say because they took into consideration whether it contradicts the Torah law or not. It just seems like it's a contradiction to you. But their basic philosophy is when they have to weigh two competing ideas, right? One is you shouldn't eat a sacred food in a state of impurity, and the other is you should participate in the Paschal lamb or you'll be guilty of kares. So then they're going to waive their rabbinic decree. But where the competing value is you shouldn't eat sacred food in a state of ritual impurity, and they extended that ritual impurity to nighttime for the acute mourner by rabbinic decree, and it conflicts with you should eat meat of the festival peace offering on Passover night. That's just a positive mitzvah. There's no negative prohibition to don't fail to eat the Paschal lamb. So in that case, the rabbinic decree comes and overrides eating the festival peace offering. We learned in the Mishna, one who hears about the death of his dead relative more than 30 days after the death, and one who gathers bones, right, in the crypt, gathers them for the ossuary, these immerse and eat sacrificial food in the evening. The Gemara expresses surprise. Can this apply to one who gathers bones? But by doing so, he came into direct contact with a corpse. If you touch the bones of a human being, you have touched a corpse. Doesn't matter how many years later it is, you touch a bone of a human being, you are going to have tuma of a corpse, right? And so at a time when sacred foods can only be eaten in a state of ritual purity, of tahara, you have become disqualified from eating these foods. So if that person, gathered bones of their deceased relative and put them in the ossuary, for sure they're tameh. In fact, they're heavy tuma, the tuma of a corpse, which is a 7-day purification requiring sprinkling with the waters mixed with the ashes of the red heifer on the 3rd and on the 7th day, and then an immersion and big purification process. How can you say that very same night he's going to be qualified to eat from the sacred food of the Korban Pesach? How is that possible? Which is what the Gemara just says. And the Gemara answers, amend the teaching of the Mishna and instead say, one for whom they gathered bones, meaning that other people gathered the bones of his parents to transfer them to a new grave, but he himself did not touch them. Even though he didn't touch the bones, he has a rabbinical requirement to observe a day of acute mourning because his immediate relative was, reburied, as it were. The bones were gathered from one place and put into another. Even though he or she did not touch those things themselves, nevertheless, the rabbis require this person to observe a day of acute mourning, and it makes sense because it's so much on, it's got to be on your mind, this immediate relative that you lost, and now their bones were just relocated. It's going to sort of like open that wound in your heart again. So you shouldn't be eating sacrificial foods in that state, but it's by rabbinic decree, and so that night the decree it ends, and then you can participate in the Paschal lamb that night. We learned in the Mishnah, with regard to a convert who converted on Erev Pesach, on Passover Eve, that there is a dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel as to whether he may immerse and eat the Paschal sacrifice in the evening. The Gemara discusses the scope of this dispute. Rabba Bar Bar Chana said that Rabbi Yochanan said that the dispute is about an uncircumcised non-Jew that was circumcised and converted on Passover Eve. Beis Hillel hold that there is a rabbinic decree due to a concern that perhaps he will become contaminated by a corpse in the following year, and he will say, last year, even though I had come into contact with a corpse just before Passover, did I not immerse and eat the Paschal lamb without completing the purification process for impurity imparted by a corpse? Now also I will immerse and eat. And he does not know and understand that last year, before his conversion on Erev Pesach, he was a non-Jew, and therefore he was not susceptible to tuma, to ritual impurity, because non-Jews do not contract ritual impurity according to Torah law. But now that he is a Jew and he is susceptible to ritual impurity, he might make a mistake if his status if he didn't have that precaution last year. So now we see, why does Beis Hillel say that one who converts that day, one who gets circumcised and immerses in the mikvah, so now he's a full-fledged convert, nevertheless, we're going to impose on him that he wait a week before he eats sacrificial foods? Because up until the moment that he was circumcised and immersed in the mikvah, he was not bound by Torah law. He had no reason to avoid coming into contact with a human corpse. I mean, he or she might, now we're talking about only the case of a male, he might find it icky to touch a human corpse, but he had no legal obligation to avoid it, or no legal obligation to understand that if he did touch it, he would become tameh, because he didn't become tameh when he was a non-Jew. This law only applies to Jews because only Jews are obligated to eat certain sacred offerings in a state of tahara. So since he had no reason to keep himself tahor, ritually pure, before that circumcision, we don't know for sure that he did so, right? And so since he might have done it and without thinking about it, and then he converted, and then he ate the Paschal lamb that same night, which Beis Shammai would allow him to do, the following year, he might recall, well, yeah, I buried that body like the day before Passover, and then the day of, that morning we buried a body, and then that afternoon I converted, and then that night I ate the Paschal lamb. So I guess touching a body doesn't prevent you, touching a corpse doesn't prevent you from eating the Paschal lamb. Lest he make that mistake, Beis Hillel imposed this kind of rabbinic decree, the classic type of rabbinic decree, to protect somebody from coming to make an error that would lead them to violate a Torah law and make a Torah transgression. That's the motivation of Beis Hillel for imposing that 1 week waiting period after the conversion. And Beis Shammai hold that we do not make a decree due to this concern, right? They think, you don't have to make that decree. Those are really exceptional circumstances. But with regard to an uncircumcised Jew who for some reason had not been circumcised until Passover Eve, all agree, meaning Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree, that he may immerse and eat his Paschal lamb in the evening. The concern that he will err the following year does not apply, and we do not decree in the case of an uncircumcised Jew who was circumcised on Passover Eve, due to the concern that the case will be confused with that of an uncircumcised Gentile who was circumcised and converted on Passover Eve. Now, why is the Jew becoming circumcised relevant to this? Because the Torah says those who are uncircumcised will not participate in eating the Paschal lamb. The exception to that would be if there was a family where tragically they had two sons who were circumcised, and the circumcision procedure, like they had some kind of blood condition or something, and it proved fatal when they were circumcised. 1 in a billion type of thing, incredibly rare. But if that happened, then they would say, okay, twice this happened, that we've established a principle that in that family it's dangerous to get circumcised. Then they have a third son. They don't circumcise him. He never has to get circumcised, right? He's not considered uncircumcised because it was a special situation. Incredibly rare. Everyone else, if for some reason the Jew was not circumcised, he's not allowed to participate in eating the Korban Pesach until he is circumcised. And that kind of situation was quite common for Jews coming out of the former Soviet Union, right? Where it's very dangerous to do any kind of Jewish ritual. People could really get hurt. Again, it was danger. And then when they finally escaped the Soviet Union, so you had a lot of adult males who would be circumcised. It wasn't for the purpose of eating the Korban Pesach, since we can't bring the Passover offering until the temple is rebuilt. But this idea of an adult circumcision for a Jew who wasn't circumcised previously happened quite often for that reason. That was also taught in a Baraisa. So now we're going to get the same principle repeated in a Baraisa, contemporaneous with the Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel did not disagree about the fact that an uncircumcised Jew who was circumcised on Passover Eve may indeed immerse and eat his Paschal lamb in the evening. With regard to what did they disagree? With regard to an uncircumcised non-Jew who converted on Passover Eve, Beis Shammai say that he may immerse and eat his Paschal lamb in the evening, and Beis Hillel say that one who separates from the foreskin is ritually impure, like one who separates from the grave, because, we're not sure, he may have come into contact with a corpse before he had his circumcision and his conversion. Rava, and that is the law. The law follows Beis Hillel on this question. Rava said, with regard to an uncircumcised non-Jew who converted, sprinkling the purification waters to purify impurity imparted by a corpse and a circumcision scalpel, the sages upheld, in other words, these two situations, the sages upheld their rabbinic decree even in the situation in which doing so would violate a prohibition that carries the punishment of kares. Right? So we said that, well, wait a minute, right? Normally a rabbinic decree, they're going to waive it if enforcing it is going to lead a person to violate a prohibition that carries the Torah punishment of kares. However, with regard to an acute mourner, a leper, meaning somebody with tzara'as, not the modern version of leprosy, and a beis haparas, which we'll define in a moment, but that's basically a field that may contain a grave, a place where there may be a human corpse, but we're not sure. In those cases, they did not uphold their decree in the face of a situation where it would lead somebody to come to violate a Torah prohibition that carries the punishment of kares. Now the Gemara will explain how there's the difference between these cases, 5 cases. So the Gemara details all the cases that Rava referred to. The case of an uncircumcised Gentile who converted is, as we have said previously, right? So the law follows Beis Hillel. So even though on a Torah law level he qualifies to eat the Korban Pesach that night, they were concerned enough about that he might come to make a mistake the following year that they ruled he should wait a week, and therefore he won't be able to participate in the Paschal lamb that first night that he's a Jew. He'll have to wait a month and come to the Pesach Sheni, as we have said previously. The case of sprinkling the purification waters to purify impurity imparted by a corpse is, as the master said in another Mishnah, sprinkling is prohibited on Shabbos due to a rabbinic decree, and it does not override Shabbos even on Passover Eve, right? So a person who was tameh due to touching a human corpse and went through the 7-day purification, and all that he's waiting for is that final sprinkling on the 7th day, and then he's going to be pure, and then he immerses and then waits for nightfall, and then he's done. So you might think that if his 7th day falls on Erev Pesach, so he's ready to eat the Korban Pesach that night. And he is, unless his 7th day is on Shabbos. Why? Because the sages made a rabbinic decree that we don't do sprinkling on Shabbos, even if it's the 7th day purification, the 7th day of the purification of somebody who touched a corpse. If that 7th day falls on Shabbos, meaning that he touched the corpse the previous Shabbos, so then we don't sprinkle him on that day. Why? Why is sprinkling something we don't do on Shabbos? That's only a rabbinic decree. And the reason is because the person is so, caught up with this idea of going through his purification and getting it all done properly that he might forget and come to carry the waters of the sprinkling through the public domain on Shabbos, and then he would have violated the Torah prohibition of carrying on Shabbos. So it's a rabbinic decree that we don't sprinkle on Shabbos. So if all this guy needs is to be sprinkled, but his seventh day when he needs that sprinkling falls on Shabbos, and that's Erev Pesach, so then we don't override. We don't allow him to be sprinkled. We don't override that rabbinic decree. We don't sprinkle on Shabbos, even though it means that he will not be able to eat the Korban Pesach that night. This is another person who's going to have to wait for Pesach Sheni, for second Passover. The case of the circumcision scalpel is as it was taught in a Baraisa, and we learned this, right? This was the dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and the other rabbis. If a circumcision scalpel was not brought to the location of the baby where it will be circumcised on Shabbos, if it was not brought before Shabbos, then just as we may not bring it through the public domain in violation of a Torah law, so too we may not bring it through roofs, through courtyards, and through enclosures, even though carrying in this manner is prohibited only by rabbinic decree. In other words, the principle is Rabbi Eliezer said, to do it if the boy baby's 8th day falls on Shabbos, we override Shabbos and circumcise him on Shabbos. Rabbi Eliezer said, if we didn't bring the scalpel to the location where he's going to be circumcised, then we would override Shabbos to carry the scalpel there that day. But the rabbis disagreed with him, led by Rabbi Akiva, and we don't carry the scalpel on Shabbos. It should have been brought before Shabbos. It could have been brought before Shabbos. The people didn't do it, and so since we don't have the knife, we don't do the circumcision, and we wait till Sunday to do that circumcision. Here, what's being said is, well, that's in terms of carrying through the public domain. But maybe the knife could be brought by going through rooftops and courtyards, which is actually going from one private domain to another. And I believe it was Rabbi Shimon who made an exception for doing that. But even though it's only by rabbinic decree that we say we don't carry through those kinds of places, nevertheless, we don't bring the scalpel on Shabbos to do the Shabbos circumcision. Where am I? One who has, and now we have this other principle. So you can't slaughter the Korban Pesach for an uncircumcised person. Now what I didn't know is, so if there's a household, right, where they have one uncircumcised person in the household who's a member of the household, so that whole household is not qualified to eat of the Korban Pesach. So you might think, well, if it's like this example of the uncircumcised Jew, like who fled the it's the uncircumcised Jew who grew up in the Soviet Union, and now he arrives at this household. Now he's a member of the household, and now nobody in that household is going to be able to participate in the Korban Pesach. So let's circumcise this guy. But if it falls out on Shabbos, we're not going to be able to carry the scalpel there to do it if we don't already have the scalpel there. In fact, we're not going to be able to circumcise him if it happens to be on Shabbos at all, because that's not an 8th day circumcision. There's no emergency, as it were, even though we allowed this thing, we neglected this procedure, and it was only possible on Erev Pesach. So if this guy doesn't get circumcised, no one in the household is going to be able to have the Korban Pesach that night. Nevertheless, we don't circumcise him if Erev Pesach happens to be on Shabbos. Okay. And the Gemara lists the cases where the sages waived their prohibition in the face of a prohibition carrying the punishment of kares. The case of the acute mourner is that which we said in the Mishna, whereas normally the acute mourner, by rabbinic decree, he still can't eat sacrificial foods that night. For the Korban Pesach, he can. We waive that rabbinic decree. And then there's the case of the leper, the one who has tzara'as, right? That physical manifestation of a spiritual malady, an outbreak of the skin, not like modern leprosy. What is this case? It is, as it was taught in a Baraisa, the one with saras, the mitzora, is ritually impure and must undergo an involved 8-day purification process, which culminates on the 8th day with the bringing of various offerings in the temple. If his 8th day occurs on Erev Pesach, such that it would be possible to bring his offerings and be fit to partake the Paschal lamb that evening, and on top of that, he saw an occurrence of a bodily emission that day, seminal fluid, and one who experiences such a discharge is ritually impure and prohibited from entering the temple so that he could bring his final offerings, so that he could complete his purification after being the mitzora, after being one with saras. So he can't complete his purification during the day. Nevertheless, we will slaughter the lamb on his behalf. He'll immerse at nightfall. Then he'll bring his offerings in the temple to complete his purification process. And then he can eat the Korban Pesach. The sages said, although normally with regard to ritual impurity from the seminal discharge, one who has immersed on that day may not enter the temple until nightfall, this one may enter. And the reason is that it is better for a positive mitzvah that has a punishment of kares, i.e. the bringing of the Paschal lamb, to come and override a positive mitzvah that does not have a punishment of kares, i.e. the mitzvah of they shall send out from the camp every leper, whoever has had issue and whoever is unclean by the dead, that's Numbers 5:2, which requires the removal from the temple of one who has immersed that day and will become pure only at nightfall, the Tevel Yom. Right, so we wouldn't let him bring those offerings. In this case, we do, so that he can participate in the Korban Pesach that night. And furthermore, Rabbi Yochanan said, by Torah law, there is not even a positive mitzvah that restricts one who has immersed that day and will become pure only upon nightfall from entering the temple. As it is stated, and Jehoshaphat stood in the congregation of Judea and Jerusalem in the house of the Lord before the new courtyard. That's 2nd Book Chronicles, chapter 20, verse 5. What is indicated by identifying the courtyards as the new courtyard? It indicates that they innovated something in it, and they said one who has immersed on that day but will become pure only upon nightfall may not enter the Levite camp. The Levite camp in the wilderness is analogous to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And this suggests that the prohibition is of rabbinic origin and is not a positive mitzvah on a Torah level. Then there's the case of the Beis Haparas, in which the sages did not uphold their decree as it was taught in a Mishna, and Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree that we examine a Beis Haparas that lies in the path to Jerusalem for those offering the Paschal lamb to determine whether there is actually any ritual impurity present, in order to enable those who pass through it to know whether they are still ritually pure and able to offer the Paschal lamb. But we do not examine a Beis Haparas for the sake of those eating teruma, in order that they should be able to eat teruma in purity. Who eats teruma? Only priests, right? So that's a consecrated food that is only available to priests to eat. They have that mitzvah to eat teruma. If they have walked over a grave, then they would become tameh and they're disqualified from eating teruma. Now they're walking through a Beis Haparas, right? So it's a path or a field where there may be a body buried under it, or there might have been a body buried somewhere in that field, which is not the area where people walk, but the field was plowed over, and so it's possible that little bits of bone got spread out over that field. Or it's a place where they commonly did eulogies, and perhaps a body was set down there and a little piece fell off a body. So it's a case of doubt. Is there a piece of a human corpse in that area or not? So they allowed for the people coming up to Jerusalem to bring their Korban Pesach, if they have to walk through that area, they can examine. What examine means is that they actually go very carefully as they walk, blowing the dust. I don't know how that means, like with a reed, then there's like a straw where they're blowing, and it's like they're sort of blowing the dust on the path to see if anything like a bone fragment gets discovered. And if they don't see a bone fragment, then the doubt is removed and those people are ruled tahor, ritually pure, and they can participate in the Korban Pesach that night. We don't make that leniency for other kinds of people who have to be in a state of ritual purity, tahara, like a priest who's going to be eating teruma. I am at the very end here, so if you've got questions or comments, I'm coming to them now, or in one moment. So what is meant when we say that we examine for those offering the Paschal lamb? Practically, how is it examined? Rabbi Yehuda said that Shmuel said one must blow the dust on the path before taking each step in the Beis Haparas as he walks through it in order to see if there's a hidden bone there. Rabbi Yehuda bar Abaye, in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, said a Beis Haparas that has been trodden underfoot is considered ritually pure, since it is assumed that any bones that were there have been removed or broken, right? If it's become like just, a very common public path through an area that once was a Beis Haparas, now if it's well trod, they assume that it is no longer a place of doubt. The sages waived this decree in a case where the necessary examination is made in order to allow people to be able to offer their Paschal lambs. However, this leniency is limited to the case of the Paschal lamb, since its neglect carries the prohibition of karas. If you don't bring the Paschal lamb and you are qualified to do so, that carries the punishment of karas. It is not extended to other cases, such as the prohibition to eat impure teruma. Note that we also had, it was a commandment for everyone to go up to Jerusalem. Did every Jew in the kingdom of Israel go up to Jerusalem on Passover? Not necessarily. If it was really impractical for them to go, or if they lived in Bavel, right, in a community just so far away that it was not possible to get up there, then you could say, well, they had to get there for Passover Sheni, the second Passover, or maybe they don't have to go up there at all. But certainly if it's possible for you to get up there, then you're obliged to get up there and do it, again, when the temple is standing, which it isn't now. All right, that's what I've got for us today. Nina shared the link again. We're having a sale right now on the AT store. So shirts like this and Grateful Yid and I Don't Roll on Shabbos, Baruch Hashem, all kinds of other great gifts. There's a 10% sale with a promo code, awesome, which you put there in the link to our store. All right, coming to questions. On Daf Tzadi Beis, page 92. Okay. We'll see about that. Okay. Oh, thank you. Joseph says, I think ossuary is pronounced ossuary. Thank you. So there we go. So that bone reliquary, there's a word I've seen before too, but that place where you put the bones of your family dead, when you move them from the crypt into the storage for the bones, that's called an ossuary. Thank you, Joseph. Michael, did they also have a Seder and eat matzah on Pesach Sheni? Great question. We're going to be talking in chapter 9 about Pesach Sheni. The next chapter is chapter 9. It's definitely part of the discussion there is Pesach Sheni. But one thing that we've already seen is it says all the laws of Pesach apply on Pesach Sheni. So does that mean the laws of how the Korban Pesach itself, the Passover offering, is brought and slaughtered and eaten? Or does it also mean about matzah and telling the story and the Seder, etc.? I'm not sure, but perhaps we'll learn in the next chapter. And Sharon says, it would appear then that the people doing the holy work of Hevra Kadisha would never be able to partake. Was there a comparable group of people in temple times? I'm sure there were. So the question is, if a body needed to be attended to that day, right? So what I would say is probably, they did this in shifts, right? So there's going to be some group of people that are on duty, and if they have to do the work of attending to the dead when the temple is standing, right, they're not going to qualify to bring the Paschal lamb that night. But then they are obligated to come back for the second Passover. And at that time, somebody else has to take their shift, right? A month later, somebody else is going to do that work of the Hevra Kadisha so they can bring it. I mean, they're gonna find practical ways to enable people to participate in this. And having 2 Passovers each year, specifically for this, for people that had to attend to the dead, I think indicates that you wouldn't say they never qualify. Then what you might ask, well, maybe they never qualified for the first Passover. And again, I think they would need to say, okay, well, this year I'm on duty first Passover, you be on duty second Passover, next year we'll trade. I mean, I would hope they would have some kind of arrangement like that. The priests had arrangements like that in terms of, their shifts, doing a week at a time in the temple, and then who's going to serve during certain holidays and stuff. I would think that rotated. Okay, that's what I've got for us this evening. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow at the regular time, Monday, 6 p.m. Pacific, to open our discussion of Chapter 9. All the best. Have a great night.